Welcome back, everybody. Left Reckoning. David here, joined as always by Matt. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man, I'm really excited to be interviewing our guest today. On the podcast, we have Dr. Robert Buzzanco, who is a professor of history at University of Houston and one of the hosts of the Green and Red podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we got a pretty big show coming, and this is a pretty broad topic, but we want to bring you on to talk about the Vietnam War and its legacy and some of the lessons, that we can draw from it today. And maybe just to start really, really big, and then we can hone it down from there. Would you tell our audience who won the Vietnam War?
50 years ago in January of 1973, when the U.S. withdrew, after the peace treaty, clearly the United States had lost that war. The Vietnamese nationalist communists had won. They had forced the Americans out. They weren't able. The U.S. was not able to preserve this country it had invented below the 17th parallel, South Vietnam, whatever you want to call it. So clearly the United States lost that war. But in the intervening years, the United States kind of continued to fight, by other means, and prevented the Vietnamese from, getting aid. Reneged on reparations that Richard Nixon had promised them, prevented the IMF and World Bank from giving loans to the Vietnamese. When in the 80s, the Vietnamese did get loans, it had to meet all kinds of, structural adjustment conditions, get rid of the private sector, exports, things like that. The U.S. encouraged China to fight a war against Vietnam in 1979, which was really costly. The United States supported, and this is the one that Americans don't believe, but the United States supported the Khmer Rouge, the killing fields, against the Vietnamese, even at the United Nations. So the United States really, continued to impose its will upon the Vietnamese. And so they kind of, any idea that they might have had of creating any kind of like socialist or revolutionary society was simply impossible. They kind of had to create, this new economy, Doi Moi, which was kind of a market-oriented economy, kind of like perestroika, what Gorbachev was trying to do in the Soviet Union. By the 90s, the Vietnamese have have normalized relations with the United States, and joined the World Trade Organization. The United States and other countries, investors began to go into Vietnam, put a lot of money into it to privatize the economy. So in that regard, the goal that the United States had when it became involved in Vietnam in the aftermath of World War II and the Cold War was to kind of prevent it from becoming a communist country or a Chinese-like country or a socialist economy or whatever, to make it part of the global economy, and it did. And so like my kind of line is always like, if LBJ were alive, he'd say like, hot damn, we won the war.
Yeah, and can you just talk about the originals motivations a little bit? You touched on it with the anti-communism. Basically my understanding is maintain imperialism in service of global anti-communism. Can you just talk about the ideological through line for the war there?
Yeah, I mean, like Ken Burns, the PBS thing was, these are people who had the best of intentions and they wanted to preserve democracy and all that. That's kind of the typical liberal line, and that's just a bunch of, kind of cover, it's propaganda. In the aftermath of World War II, clearly, you have the Cold War where the United States is trying to prevent these communist and in fact nationalist movements, and the Vietnamese are both. It's a nationalist movement, but clearly the people leading it were part of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And so in the aftermath of the war, the United States, actually the US didn't really care all that much about Vietnam. It wasn't that important, but it was important to the French. And because it was important to the French, it became important to the Americans. In addition to that, and that's kind of, I think, accepted by a lot of people who write about this, but there's another factor that I think is important. The United States was trying to recreate capital or create capitalism in Asia. And the initial goal was to do it with Japan and China, but after October of 1949, obviously China is not going to be part of that. So the United States was concerned about these nationalist, communist, whatever movements in Asia. First, they didn't want them to kind of go the Chinese way, but then they also wanted to make sure that Japan, which would be the linchpin of this reconstruction in Asia, would have trading partners, places where it could get raw materials, places where it could get labor, places where it can invest in trade and markets. And so Vietnam, which really, on its own isn't all that important, did become important in that kind of more regional arrangement in order to kind of rebuild capitalism. So yeah, it's clearly within this imperial structure, this imperial framework. And the rhetoric is about capitalism, or I'm sorry, about democracy and human rights and all that kind of stuff. But clearly the government the United States created and supported in the South, wasn't democratic and didn't, care about human rights or anything like that. So that was a cover. But yeah, it's within this imperial framework to try to develop these capitalist markets all over the globe, not just in Europe, but in Asia as well.
Yeah, and I mean, like, talking about the human rights and democracy question, I mean, could you talk a bit? I think most of our audience is obviously familiar with like Vietnam as, is like a history of like true like American brutality, but the effect of the war there for Vietnamese people, the destruction, the loss of life, like the damage, plays a major role in the inability of the Vietnam government after the war to really be able to create the kind of system that they want, because it's just pure crisis mode after the U.S. leaves. Correct?
Yeah, I think you can't understate how vicious and brutal that war was, and a lot of the newer scholarship kind of wants to give agency to the Vietnamese, and that's fine. But the reality is, you can't analyze this war at all without the immense, I mean, immense is understating, role the United States played, the destruction, the brutality. I mean, just the data, like 2 to 3, probably close to 3 million Vietnamese were killed, mostly civilian. The U.S. dropped 4.6 million tons of bombs. It destroyed countless villages. There are still 80 million unexploded bomblets, the little bombies in Laos. So Laos and Cambodia were also affected in the same way. Created 15 million refugees. The United States had free fire zone search and destroy missions. Just brutality, things like My Lai, which kind of got all kinds of attention and should. But the reality is, unfortunately, My Lai was in no way aberrant. Those kinds of things happened. It was, I mean, obviously World War II is a global war, but outside of that, I can't think of any war, any conflict, any attack that was as humanly, just like brutal and vicious and costly as what the United States did. And I mean, it's a war crime in so many ways. At one point, Nixon gave orders to Kissinger. What was it? Anything that flies against anything that moves, which is just that's just a commando for global war crime, massive war crimes.
And it's generational too, right? I mean, like, children today are still born with the scars of this war.
I mean, yeah, I mean, just the ego side, the physically, yeah, you have the massive use of dioxins and Agent Orange, I think 20 million gallons or something like that, napalm. So you have in Vietnam, you still have orphanages with kids being born, without limbs, with encephalopathy, with cancers are rampant, and they are among American veterans of the Vietnam War as well. And then, of course, the psychological and mental scars are indescribable, probably immeasurable, but they're there as well, especially in Vietnam.
Could you talk? Oh, sorry, Matt.
I just want to say, like, that's one of like the things, because my dad graduated in 1977, so a little bit young, but he has a lot of hunting buddies that were Vietnam vets, and a lot of difficulties. And like growing up and learning more about the conflict, it seems like we had this idea that what was so damaging was how much stress you're under, like on the jungle fighting conditions, and someone might pop out at you. But like, it might have been like, talk about like Zippo squads and like what soldiers were asked to do, basically to fight that war a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a better informed army. Because of media. They were kind of aware of what was happening in the United States. They were kind of aware of the anti-war movement. I've talked to veterans who said that they were reading, Ramparts and, reading Chomsky in the New York Review and stuff like that. And yeah, I mean, it was a brutal war. So yeah, you're right. They're being asked to burn down villages and to attack civilians and things. So things like My Lai really weren't all that aberrant. That you have young kids. They're some of them are 19, 20, 21 years old from wherever, the Midwest. You kind of have this stereotype, right? The farm kid from Iowa or whatever. But the reality is, like, a lot of them are kind of, they're asked to go over here to fight these people who they don't know and haven't really harmed them. And you have stuff going on in the U.S. which leads to Obviously, racial antagonism in Vietnam. Martin Luther King's famous speech where he says, you're asking young white guys and young black guys to fight and die together in solidarity when, in the United States, they don't have the same rights. And, for a lot of people, that idea of killing is important too, because a lot of vets and a lot of the accounts you read would say, like, I don't want to kill. It's like, I don't want to be killed, right? Which is kind of an obvious thing. But a lot of them said, like, I don't want to kill people I don't know. I mean, there's no real cause for this. Like in World War II, it's the good war, and you have Hitler, and you have the Holocaust, and all this stuff, which is easy to kind of, promote. Whereas in Vietnam, nobody really believes that Ho Chi Minh is Hitler and he's going to take over the world. When you get there, you're kind of seen as a replacement for the French and even the people you're there, to fight with. This is the thing that always kind of blows me away. And the vast majority of the attacks in Vietnam occurred below the 17th parallel. The United States attacked its ally in the South, in the Republic of Vietnam, far more air attacks, B-52s, fighter jets, howitzers, helicopter attacks. So most of the war took place in the country it had created and was allegedly trying to save. And soldiers saw that, and they're, they're out there committing these atrocities. And, this is not the idea of America they had been brought up with in the Cold War. And, the reality was there, and, this just kind of shook all their foundations.
Can you give people a short biography of Ho Chi Minh? Because I feel like he doesn't loom as large in the consciousness maybe like Mao or someone does.
Yeah, I think he's a fascinating guy. He was born into a fairly well-educated family. His father worked with the French administrative government, so he was well-educated. He grew up in this kind of nationalist environment. There were these Vietnamese scholars and poets who were also warriors, famously a guy named Phan Boi Chau. So Ho was aware of all that. He grew up with this kind of nationalist fervor. He left Vietnam. He studied in Japan, which was kind of where the anti-Western Asian young people went. Then he went to Paris, which is where the expat community was. And in Paris, he met a lot of the people who we would, his comrades for the rest of his life, Van Zap, Lê Duan, Trung Chin, and formed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. He went to Versailles and tried to meet Woodrow Wilson in 1919 to talk about, the rights of colonial and oppressed colonials. People, made his way around, was in jail in China, had connections to both the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party, and later the People's Republic of China. Created the Viet Minh, which was a nationalist group, and the public goal was always a nationalist revolution to get rid of the French. And so it was like a revolution that included, peasants, landowners, anybody who was anti-French, basically. In 1946, declared Vietnamese independence, had it stolen away from him when the French re-entered in 1954 after Dien Bien Phu. Once again, thought he was the leader of a sovereign and united Vietnam, had that stolen away when the United States at the conference in Geneva cut the country in half. He's a communist. There's no doubt about it. A doctrinaire communist. He's familiar with Lenin and Marx, and really connected to both the Soviet Union and the Chinese, but Vietnam and China. And there's so many American mistakes, but Vietnam and China have traditionally been enemies. They still are, right? Traditionally been enemies. And so the United States thought that Ho was just a puppet of Mao Zedong, and that was never the case. And so the U.S. kind of approached it that way. Got a lot of aid, more from the Soviet Union than from the People's Republic of China. Wanted to kind of, didn't want to fight a war against the United States, obviously. Tried to kind of, find solutions short of that. If the U.S. hadn't intervened in the war, it would have never, it would have ended a lot sooner, right? Ho Chi Minh would have been, in charge again of a united Vietnam. But as a tactician, just a brilliant guy. Often, like, his comrades would often get on him because he would go slowly, but he was just like, you could see like several steps ahead. He thought a war against the French eventually, but didn't want to. His idea basically was that the French and the Americans weren't going to be in Asia forever. The real problem was always going to be China. At one point, when the French came back in, he said the day of the white man in Asia is over. And he said, I would rather sniff French shit for 5 years than eat Chinese shit for another 1,000 years.
Wow.
And so, I mean, his goal was always that he masterfully plays the U.S., the Soviet Union, and the Chinese off against one another. I mean, I think he's a true revolutionary. I think he and Fidel Castro, who for people, a lot of people like in my generation, really are iconic. We're legit. I mean, there's a lot of lefties we can debate at great length about, but Ho Chi Minh really had this vision. He supported other third world countries like Castro did, like Mandela did, like Sankara did. But just, I think, a brilliant strategist, a tactician who understood kind of, he wrote poetry. And, when he died in 1969, and, we can quibble about that, but clearly I think the people who took over after him, and for a lot of reasons, including the brutal U.S. war, which I think the biggest reason, really kind of strayed away from the kind of Vietnam he wanted to create. But I mean, I'm kind of in the tank for Ho Chi Minh.
Yeah.
Tank,
I think one of the first things I ever learned about Ho Chi Minh was in a Hitchens essay, Chris Hitchens essay I was reading in high school, and it was him deploying Thomas Jefferson in some diplomatic exchange with the U.S. and live up to your stuff, guys.
In 1946, when he proclaimed Vietnamese independence, he opened it by saying, all men and women are created equal. And then he quoted Thomas Paine's, the rights of man, right? So, and he wrote letters to Harry Truman saying, hey, we don't have anything against the United States and so on. But yeah, I mean, the speech he gave in September of 1946 is really quite remarkable when you look at it, because it clearly adopts all these kind of Western liberal ideas that really weren't common in Vietnam at all.
Well, I was wondering, I know you've been sort of touching on it, but for our audience, particularly like the younger audience, obviously, like when we're talking about Vietnam, there's the American context, which is very important in what ends up happening in Vietnam over the next 50 years. But, could you give people like a sense of like, what that relationship with the Soviet Union was like? I know you've talked a little about China, but because I think that, for a lot of like socialists and Marxists, like post USSR, there's a kind of like pining for like that order, and I don't think there's a lot of understanding of like what the kind of global system was for countries like Vietnam that fought a war against the United States, and what the relationship with a country like the Soviet Union was.
I mean, the Soviet Union supported those movements. They gave Vietnam a significant amount of aid, to the fact where it like really created economic problems after the Vietnam War. They sent advisors there. They provided diplomatic aid, and they did this. And especially in the post-Stalin era, it's a lot easier to kind of deal with what they did. But they really were a counterweight to the West, to the empires of the West, right? And which. You don't need to defend Stalinism to say that, once that is gone after the, early 90s, the West just has nothing in the way. It can do the kind of thing that it's done since then. But Ho was never a captive of the Chinese or the Vietnamese. And again, if you read the stuff, and there's been a ton of stuff that's been declassified and translated in Vietnamese sources, especially the Cold War International History Project and the National Security Archive have great collections on that. And that's why I think the guy was able to like kind of operate in this incredible, environment where you have Mao Zedong, Stalin, and Khrushchev, and Brezhnev, these like giants, right, with immense power. And this guy who, is in charge of the Communist Party of a fairly small country that's being pummeled by the United States, is able to kind of, operate within that and quite successfully get a significant amount of aid, but never become captive to any of those countries. I mean, with regard to China, as soon as the Vietnam War ended, the Vietnamese and the Chinese were already kind of, going at it. And the United States was encouraging China. Jimmy Carter, who, has done great stuff as president, since his presidency, but as president was just typical Cold Warrior. Nothing unique there. So, but, those communist countries really did provide, cover and shield for, the Cuban Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Sandinista Revolution, I think as a lefty myself, I think there's some real virtue in that to create a different world,
No, totally. I mean, I'm just curious in the sense of like capacity, right? The like the capital that like the Western countries hold versus like the Soviet Union in like the 80s. up until its collapse, sort of like materially, is it strong enough of a counterweight to sort of like be able to recreate and deal with all the damage that's done to a country like Vietnam after the United States, right?
Yeah. I mean, the Soviet Union was held in, esteem throughout the world, throughout the third world in the 70s and 80s. And the United States had lost that after World War II, and this is why people like Ho or Nasser or Sukarno were considered threats, because they kind of presented this different, and the Soviet Union, whether for propaganda reasons or not, supported those countries. And I mean, today, if you look at Russia, which is, an imperial, horrific, monstrous power, but at the same time, much of the world doesn't have any real dog in the war in Ukraine. They don't have a dog in the hunt. And a lot of, the Saudis and the Indians continue to trade with Russia. And so I think Americans are unable to kind of understand the idea that the rest of the world doesn't see things this way.
No, I mean, like totally, like Lula, for example, gets, people get very mad at him. But again, like, yeah, if you don't have like the American perspective,
historical context.
Yeah.
And AMLO just said he's going to work to kind of, normalize relations with Cuba. And I mean, just like, I think in the United States, we're caught up in this rhetoric and this frenzy. Although I don't know. I mean, if you look at polling, most Americans say we should normalize relations with China, or even North Korea. Most Americans say there's no, So I think, you clearly have the real bipartisanship, obviously, is this empire, this military industrial complex. But I mean, with regard to Vietnam, I think, a lot of Americans opposed the war on moral grounds. They didn't just think it was a mistake. I thought it was morally wrong. A lot of Americans, at various points, majorities, opposed the war. And now the United States and Vietnam have a really strong relationship. There's good trade. The U.S. invested, I think, $2.8 billion just last year in Vietnam. Trade has increased, I forget, over the last 10 or 15 years, like 200-fold or something like that. It's just an immense amount. So, but, as someone who kind of grew up, not in the Cold War itself, but, a little beyond, not long beyond that, the role that the Soviet Union played, I think, is important in kind of creating kind of spaces for some of these movements, which, you can talk about human rights or this or that, but you can't compare the countries the United States supported, the regimes the U.S. supported were by far the most brutal violators of human rights in that era. When you talk about the Guatemalan regime or the Shah, the Khmer Rouge, actually, which, most people don't know about, or Pinochet or whatever. So I actually have a fairly positive impression, while fully aware of the flaws of those societies, of what they did.
No, I mean, I think like internationally, the fall of the Soviet Union really, flipped the script and made it very difficult for countries like Vietnam and Cuba even too.